Hi everyone, my name's John Barclay, Managing Director at Barclays. Welcome to our next instalment of our Explorer series where we'll be discussing the discovery process. Today, Tony Wittcomb will be joining me.
Hi everybody.
Tony's our Director of Consulting and we'll be taking the opportunity to talk you through the discovery process. So let's start with the previous webinar we went through around Whitespace, and we talked about the concept of getting from A to B, so current state to future state. So just explain that a little bit to us, Tony, the difference between A state and B state.
A state is a reflection of where organisations and leaders are. So it's a reflection of what the information they've got that describes where they sit culturally, what their values and beliefs are, a view of how they are behaving from an organisational point of view or from a system point of view.
Yeah.
It's the easy element, I guess, in this process, because often people have a view of where they are. It may not necessarily be a complete view or an accurate view, hence the reason why we're sort of talking about a discovery process.
Yeah.
But it's a view of their current situation.
Yeah.
The B state is a view of where they want to get to. And that can be rather, have a different level of detail. They may have a view or a picture in their mind that might be informed by things that are happening within the organisation or outside the organisation. But it's a direction that they want to head into. Often when organisations get to that sort of point, they're faced with the sort of key challenge is, what do I do next?
Yeah.
What's the start? How do I move from A to B? And the challenging bit is the sort of the blankness of I could do lots and lots of different things, but I'm not quite sure which one is the most important.
And which one's going to get us in the direction of B space anyway.
So they're faced with this sort of, and it's a little bit like the blank page. I've probably got an idea about what I need to put on the page, but I'm not quite sure what the first line is. And that's the whiteness, that's the blankness. And our term for that is white space.
Yep.
That's where that sort of comes from.
So people might be familiar with, assess your current, what's happening now, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are some things you want to address. And B space, people might be familiar with that as our vision.
Yes.
This is where we want to be, this is how we want to behave, this is our culture. And that white space is that unknown steps of how to get there, and it can be quite blinding for people.
It's the linkage between the 2 points, and it is what we find as leaders when we leap into that space eventually. It's actually maybe not quite as daunting as we thought it was going to be, because once we start the journey, we actually begin to recognise some of the things that we're experiencing.
Yeah.
And we try to sort of replicate that on the screen. So you don't start a journey, you don't really start any journey without having at least some idea of where you're going.
Yeah,
so
you've got to have a plan.
You've got to have a plan, you need a map. Nobody starts to go from anywhere to anywhere unless they've got at least some understanding of what that map looks like. So part of the discovery process is the beginnings of trying to understand some of the content and some of the input into developing that map.
Yeah.
Hence that's the sort of graphic of the GPS.
The satellite part.
So
identifying how we can move from step A, step B, step C.
And it's giving a guidance, a route through the white space. When individuals sort of start to work through the journey, they'll find things that they are relatively familiar with. So that they're the larger hazards, the larger things that they're going to experience, that they can recognise almost immediately.
Yeah.
And that they're generally predictable. So you know generally what sort of path or what track they're going to follow, what the impact is likely to be, and you'll probably have an idea of a strategy or strategies to try and tackle them. That familiarity is, and they're generally short-lived. You can actually resolve them in a relatively short space of time. From our point of view, we call those asteroids because of their predictability and their relatively small size.
So based on your organisation, your industry, your size, there'll be certain obstacles along the way that you can reasonably understand. You've probably experienced them before, you've probably had to manage them before, but they become a part of the plan as well, because you generally know they exist, you generally know when they occur, and you can put plans in place.
There's an element of predictability about them.
Yeah.
You've got an idea about where they're going to go from and to, and how they're going to get there, the speed that they travel, etc. So that predictability means that you can actually plan for them quite easily in relative terms.
Yeah, you can preempt them.
Yeah.
Versus the black hole.
They're a lot. The black hole is obviously a lot more challenging. So these tend to be much bigger issues that you'll face that you often don't see coming at all, because they're just not visible consciously. But when they do turn up, they have a tendency, as a black hole does, is it draws in lots and lots of other elements. So it has a tendency to suck the organisation into a particular issue or a particular theme or a particular trouble, and has the potential, therefore, to take people's consciousness or concentration away from what they're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, because it can actually draw them back in that journey. It can actually take them back a
They
fair way.
They lose the control in terms of what they're doing a little bit. So direction, speed, input, workload all get affected by getting drawn into black holes.
And people might be familiar with the term blind spot, something you're not aware is happening. You're not even aware you're heading down that path. So the reason why we've shifted the language from just a blind spot, because a blind spot just means you can't see it, which is similar to a black hole. You can't really see that. But it's actually describing the difference between something we can predict happening that hits a short term, like an asteroid, versus a black hole which draws not just a problem in, but it actually draws the whole organisation backwards.
I guess one of the ways of thinking about this is that one of the differences is the black hole has the potential for disrailing the whole process. A blind spot, generally because of its smaller size, you can manage that and still keep on broadly on track. Yeah. But a black hole can actually kill the whole program completely, simply because of what it does to the rest of the organisation.
What are some common ones we identify there?
So blame or judgment. Those are sort of two of the more obvious ones. Having sort of not recognising sort of the having fixed views. So the bias can be quite a
big
challenging
one.
Challenging in the sort of black hole space. But so, and again, they're not things that people don't recognise when you actually say this is like, I recognise that. It's more about the fact that you actually don't see them until they're often well established.
And you don't even realise it's happened until you've drawn everything in.
Yep.
Because you've gone down blame, judgment, created fear. It's taken us a step back on our journey of creating an open and transparent, trusting environment, for example.
And by the time you find that they're actually present, a lot of time has possibly passed from when you actually started your journey, and you may find that you're completely in a different place than you expected to be.
Yeah. So the discovery process is doing a few things here, isn't it? It's helping us define our current state, our A space. It's also helping us define our vision or our B space, so getting that understanding about where we're trying to go. It's about creating a plan, a navigational process, steps to overcome some of that white space, that unknown steps, those unknown journey.
The early starting point.
Identifying those common obstacles we're going to find, such as asteroids here that people have experienced before. We can reasonably predict them. We can put them in as a part of the plan to make sure that we protect ourselves from them. And also start to define some of those black holes and what are some of those things that we're going to experience along the way, so we can identify them as early as possible and withdraw away.
So that's about sort of trying to find a key indicator of the presence of a black hole.
So in context, we spent a whole series event talking about Whitespace in more detail. So for those who want to go into that a bit more detail, feel free to go back and watch that series. But we're going to talk a bit more about how you can go about the discovery process to identify what's important and some methodologies for that and some of the key considerations you're going to need as a part of that discovery process to be effective. Let's start with some foundational concepts. There's generally three key things we look foundationally in an organisation that drives performance, such as leadership practices, such as the system and the value it brings and the value people have in the system, and of course the cultural maturity. They interconnect.
Yes.
So
they don't work isolation.
Yeah, and they all influence each other in a degree. So what do we get when leadership practices and systems value align in regards to performance? What's an outcome of that, and why does that come about?
One of the outcomes, so the system and the leadership alignment helps If it works well, it helps leaders actually lead rather than manage.
Yep.
So the system can actually be quite restrictive, or it can be quite enabling. So if it's restrictive, it tends to focus the attention of the leader on management activity rather than leadership activities.
Yep.
So they get bogged down in the systemization of approvals, and the system is very restricting in terms of what it's requiring the leader to do. It's very layered. There's lots of transactional activity to do, which means it restricts the leader's ability to be able to do leadership activities, which is therefore restricting the value of having those two things work in tandem. The problem that you get from that is that when the leader is managing and not leading, he's obviously he or she can quite subconsciously restrict the ability of the team to be empowered.
Yeah.
Because the leader takes the decision-making process and the control away from the team because he or she is managing, not leading.
Yeah.
And therefore you have a negative impact from an empowerment point of view, that people don't feel empowered to do things. And that's generally because the system is pushing the organisation through the leader into more of a management type activity at leadership level.
And what are some of those common symptoms we see in the system elements that restrict leadership and actually impact empowerment? What are some of the common things?
So if there are quite restrictive practices in terms of decision-making process, so there's a lot of layers to go through to make a decision, or they can be quite restrictive in terms of authority levels, or there's lots of approvals to be gained through the layers of an organisation. So simply a leader doesn't have the ability to make a decision that he or she needs to do to move forward without getting a box ticked or several boxes ticked, or to complete a fairly lengthy document to then go and get signatures. Those sort of systemization elements may be adding, in some people's views, degree of control, but the control is actually working in a negative sense because it's removing people's ability to be empowered.
Yeah. So it becomes quite burdensome on people, doesn't it? And therefore then, that starts to impact the leaders' practices, but it also then starts to go the other way, which can impact the culture maturity, which we'll talk about shortly. So on the other side of that then, so if leadership practices and systems, when they work well together, actually creates empowerment, when they're not working well, they can remove empowerment.
Yep.
And difficult for people to do their work. How does leadership practices and culture maturity impact each other, and what's the outcome of that?
So this is about how the leader generates an environment which encourages people to contribute, particularly if they can get people to contribute to go the extra mile. And so it's about, I guess, a part of the essence is about recognition. So do leaders recognise people's contribution in a timely sense? Are they doing it as close as possible to when the contribution's been made? But secondly, are they doing it publicly so people can see the value of their extra contribution? So there is a need to do private one-to-one recognition, but where people have gone above and beyond, that public recognition of this is the behaviour, this is the value that we're actually valuing, goes a long way to getting sort of people within the organisation to recognise their contribution is valued, and therefore they're more prepared to put time and effort in to go the extra element. And that's where you get the citizenship, because it builds a cultural representation within the business or within the organisation that everybody feels as though they want to put the extra bit in because it's successful, and they're getting dual success. So part of the success is clearly the business provides success. But secondly, and the second element is that they get personal success out of this. So they get, the leader then provides an opportunity to develop. So the recognition can provide development opportunities because it helps to sort of show individuals' capability.
So the leadership practices, and the more mature the culture becomes, and for those who have seen other parts of our Explorer series, we've talked about culture maturity of being either reactive or conforming or achieving or integral. So if you've got an integral culture and you've got leadership practices, and we do quite a few Explorer series around the different practices as well, of commitment, curiosity, actively caring, and interconnectedness. When those practices are really working well and the culture maturity is growing, you get that extra citizenship behaviour, and combine that with a system that enables empowerment. You get people you don't get that constraint anymore. You actually get people going above and beyond, helping each other out, doing those extra miles to actually get safer outcomes, more effective outcomes, more efficient outcomes.
And I think that one of the key things that organisations can look for here is it's not just so you may get functional citizenship where they're quite prepared to help their own team members and also teams within their same function. Where you get added benefit, where you can see that the cultural maturity is improving, increasing, is they go cross functions.
Yeah.
So it's I'm now helping anybody in my organisation, not just people that are in my team or in my unit.
Yeah.
Once you get beyond those functional boundaries, that's when true citizenship behaviour becomes really valuable to an organisation, and that's driven by leadership practices.
So what about the connection then between the culture maturity and the systems value?
So this is all about the degree to which the system is either complicated or complex, or provides freedom for people to be able to operate. So is the system restricting behaviour or is it enabling behaviour? So does it allow people the freedom to make decisions and to operate in a way which allows them to get the best out of their role? Or is it very conforming, very constricted, which means that they can't operate beyond a very, very tight boundary? So you're either narrowing people's capability and abilities or you're widening them. So that's one of the elements there. The second element is the system allowing the identification and use of improvement opportunities? Does it encourage people to find new ways or new things, new ways of doing things?
Yeah.
And to a certain degree, it also needs to recognise that not all of those will work. So it's got to embrace this sort of failure process of failure as a learning activity. And therefore, the system should be able to cope with the fact that not everything is going to be successful.
Yeah.
I think the other element of this is the sort of recognition, and we've spoken about this a couple of times in some of our other sort of series, is about the sort of work imagined, work done linkage. So a system is never going to be complete and global enough to be able to describe every eventuality that an individual will experience in their role.
Yep.
But if the culture or the organisational culture is that you have to follow the system, that's people believing that work imagined is actually the same as work done, and it never is.
Yeah.
And so people then will tend to, particularly if individuals get in hot water about not following the system religiously and rigidly, that tends to drive a particular type of culture, which is more of a conforming, for a certain degree reacting. When what you're looking for is the accepting integral culture where it's a guide. It's just giving you a framework. And yes, there are some things in there that you have to do, but it can't possibly cover every eventuality.
Yeah. And the key outcome we're talking about here, when the culture and the system work hand in hand, well, you've got a really mature culture, you've got a system that supports that. So the system gives you enough boundaries, but the culture allows you to function within that consistently. Yeah. And there's a difference between behavioural reliability and compliance.
Yes.
And that's the significant part here, isn't there?
It is, because what you want to do is try to get to a situation where you can rely on the type of behaviour that you're going to get in certain situations.
Yeah.
But you still allow the freedom and flexibility for people to be able to make their own decisions.
Yeah, which leads to empowerment.
Which leads to empowerment, because not every situation is going to be the same. Behaviour, the opposite of that is the rigidity of behaviour. You're never going to achieve that. It never gives you a positive outcome.
No. So I guess in summary here, it's about integrating systems effectiveness. So making sure the systems effectiveness gives us the right boundaries, but not too constraining and burdensome. Leadership practices around commitment, curiosity, actively caring, and interconnectedness, which actually allows people to feel like they're being led and they're empowered and they're recognised and they're important. And the culture maturity itself, being as integral as possible, gives you a position where your performance can be extreme excellence.
Yep. I mean, that's the sweet spot in the middle of the diagram. If those three sort of elements are interconnected and interconnect well, you do hit the centre of the Venn diagram, and that's the sweet spot that organisations need to aim for.
So when you look at the white space that we talked through before about A space, B space, this is the model we use to really look at where are you at now in this, and based on that, where do you want to be?
Yes.
Based on these.
That's right. So we're looking to gather data or getting a view of where the organisation sits in each of these three spaces, and then, as we say, combine that information together to actually look at it from a performance point of view.
And this is, as we go through this, we'll talk a bit about the importance of looking at all of this together, because, just looking at how well the system's working versus what our leaders are doing versus what our culture is on their own may not necessarily paint the clearest picture.
You get a picture, but it's probably not the clearest, and it's almost certainly not the best.
So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail, and we've spoken about this briefly before in some of our other series as well, and we've generally just touched on it today. I want to try and get into a bit more detail for people. We're talking about this as sort of our atmosphere, aren't we? We're talking about this what's around us, our environment. This is what it's like, and it's holistic.
Yeah.
And we talk through some of these things. So let's break them down in a bit more detail. So the first thing we look at, so what does your culture look like?
Mm-hmm.
What are we looking for here, and how do we know?
So we look at, I guess this is about looking for the difference between a collective culture and a distinct culture. So what do I mean by that? So an organisation obviously is a combination of lots of different units or parts or teams.
Different teams.
Different teams. They may be all situated in one location, or they could be spread across multiple locations.
Multiple countries.
Multiple countries even. So when you look at the organisation, look at the culture, are you seeing one culture which permeates across everybody and all organisation units and all teams? Or are you seeing lots of distinct cultures that differ quite a lot, or even quite a lot, or enough to be able to see the difference between these organisational units or teams? So that's an important element to work out, because that can tell you a lot about the organisation and how it's sort of using and generating culture across the business.
Because if you're seeing consistency across the teams, what does that indicate to us? So if you're seeing multiple teams with a similar culture, there's not a lot of variation, they've got the same types of beliefs and same types of actions and values. I mean, what does that tend to indicate to us?
So it's a strong reflection of the consistency of leadership across the organisation and the values that the leaders are trying to embed or generate right throughout the organisation, that they're being consistently accepted and reflected back.
Yep.
If you're seeing lots of variation between units, it's an indication that the leaders are not aligned.
Yep.
Because the values that the leaders are
exhibiting
are not aligned either.
Yep.
So another reflection of that is that lots of organisations have cultural artifacts and have things which identify their values or their mission or their vision or their purpose.
Yep.
And there are lots of things in the organisation that are generally a reflection of the culture. One of the things to look at is, are you seeing alignment or a misalignment between the artifacts and what's happening? So the poster on the wall or the values may talk about certain things, but in the organisation, are you seeing evidence of those being exhibited or being demonstrated by people?
So the first part we're talking about there is the consistency of cultural norms. Then we're looking at the maturity of those norms.
Yep.
So we might have consistency or differences,
Yep.
But we might have consistency on the lower end of maturity. So the whole organisation's culture could be reactive,
Yep.
or the whole organisation's culture could be quite achieving or integral. Versus we might have pockets of reactive and pockets of integral.
Yeah. And that's usually the norm.
That's usually.
It's very rare to find a particularly a larger organisation where you see a consistent level of cultural maturity across every area and every part of the business. That's quite rare. You'll see variations. And this sort of focus is about trying to understand the level of variation and hopefully getting some insight into why the variation is occurring.
And if we're thinking of it, variation is normal, I guess at a cultural maturity, what we're trying to achieve as an organisation is less variability as possible, because you're going to want some variability to a degree, but it's going through there. So the next thing we look at then, as you said, is a representation of leadership. So we've separated how senior leaders are leading versus how frontline leaders are leading. So let's talk about them both hand in hand for a moment. Why do we separate them, and what are we looking for?
So clearly there is a difference in role between a senior leader and a frontline leader.
Yep.
So that the senior leaders are there, they're to set direction, expectations, they set vision, they're about generating strategic views. And so their vision, their time horizons are often a lot longer.
Yep.
They're talking about months and quarters rather than days and weeks. And they're looking for different things. So they're looking for a view to say, is the vision or the values or the direction we're following being successful, and can I see the organisation is aligned behind it? The frontline leaders have obviously got much more of a shorter time horizon, and they're generally the ones that are managing or leading the team. The people are actually doing the work. So their focus is obviously a lot different in terms of time horizons, and the sorts of things that they're looking to achieve are different than those things that senior leaders will be focusing on.
And the critical part here is when senior leaders are visible and they understand what they're trying to achieve long-term vision-wise and values-wise, whenever they do culture understanding or look into the culture, there's generally very little surprises.
So are they basically seeing what they expect to see?
Yeah.
Or are they open enough to be able to look for the things that are there but they're not picking up? So this is maybe where the blind spot bit can be more useful from a senior leader is that the fact that they're not seeing something doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It's just they're not maybe looking for it.
And if something's not moving, that could be because of the way it's being represented to or aligned to the frontline leaders.
Yep.
And they keep falling into black holes.
Yep. And one of the things here, I think that we've spoken about this on previous sort of series, is the leader approaching his or her role with a sense of curiosity. So trying to understand what they're seeing and why they're seeing it, but also what am I not seeing that maybe I would expect to see.
Yep.
And using one of the things you mentioned, John, is about the visibility, is being visible enough to be able to work out whether the direction that I'm expecting the business or my team to go, and the things that I'm expecting of them, am I actually seeing them? And if I am, why am I seeing them? Can I build on that? But if I'm not, I need to be curious enough to work out why that's the case.
Yeah. And that's where those practices, again, we can look at from a senior leaders, but a different version of it at frontline leaders of commitment, curiosity, caring, and interconnectedness. So when we look at the frontline employee engaging, what are we looking for here? What gives us a sense of engagement?
Noise. So if the frontline leaders are doing their job properly, or are operating in the type of frontline leader that we're looking for, they'll be planning, they'll be problem solving, they'll be
talking,
improvements,
giving feedback.
They'll be giving feedback. They should be actively engaged in dealing with their team on a regular basis.
Yeah.
One of the reflections of that, so that generates a certain type of culture for the team. And if they do that well, the culture is quite open and quite sort of empowering.
Yeah. It's quite observable though, isn't it?
It is. You'll see the physical elements. That one of the physical elements is noise. So in an engagement or in a situation where there is a team leader and their team, and it's a communication process, or pre-start, or a toolbox,
or planning
session,
work planning,
or anything to do with work planning. Is it a one-way transactional process, or is it a two-way communication activity? So if the leader is providing information or asking for input, and you hear lots of noise and there's lots of opinions, that tends to suggest that there's an engaging environment for the employees to be within.
Yeah. But
if you hear crickets or lots of silence, that in itself is sort of fixing the other end of the process, or the end of the scale, where the employees don't feel as though they're engaged, they're not supported, they're not interested or willing to contribute, probably because of the environment that the leaders are generating within that team.
Yep. So flicking over to the other side, where it's probably a little bit more systems and process orientated, we've talked a fair bit about it in the foundations model, so I think we can be fairly reflective here. How are business systems being used, and what are we looking for here?
So we're looking for their level of effectiveness. Are they, again, we touched on this, are they restricting the opportunity for individuals to work, or are they enabling? But another couple of important things is, are they sort of interconnected? So do they work collectively across the organisation, or are they still very much functionally orientated, which means that you're in one functional, you're being asked to do one thing, but in a different function, you're asked to be doing something completely different, but there's the same element or the same organisational
the same process or
same
requirement.
Process. Yeah. So it's about working out whether they're sort of interconnected, and again, are they simple to use or are they complicated?
And we get a sense of that of both just the system itself, the look and the feel of it, but it's also about what people talk about, how people describe it. So it's a combination of being able to get information about the system, not just what's on the paper.
Yeah.
Paperwork tells us layers, process. Is it empowering or is it restricting? Is it multi-layered?
Are people complimentary about it, or are they not?
Yeah.
It's a very simple question. You get a very simple answer.
Yeah.
Pretty straight away to know whether the system is positive or not.
And in a previous Explorer series, we talked about exposure as the combination of hazards, things that can cause harm or loss, and the behaviours around how we interact with those.
Yep.
So we're looking for how those things are being managed.
Yes.
So what are we really looking for here?
So it's hazard, potential to cause harm. So is there a clarity within the organisation about what hazards are? So are they really describing hazards, or are they describing the reflection of hazards or the consequence of a hazard? And that works in the safety space, but equally in the business space as well.
And people might be familiar with just general risk management, but it's getting it back to a more of a simplistic, practical model. And
what we find often is that the fundamental of recognising what a hazard is can be the first flaw in the process.
Yeah.
Then, from an exposure point of view, it's about the behaviours that are associated with the hazard. So, are the behaviours what the organisation wants to see? So, are they safe behaviours? And again, safe can be health and safety related, or it can be business in terms of the risk level of impact of the hazard can have on the business.
Could be quality related, client related. Yep.
Or are they at risk? Are they actually increasing the potential for the harm to occur, and therefore the exposure goes up? So it's a global view at risk, not necessarily just a health and safety view at risk.
And that's really about just keeping ourselves operating effectively and efficiently, and therefore then just reducing the impact on the business.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about the last two together, because we're talking about critical performance and KPIs and how they're used and the impact of all of them. So what should we be looking for in this space around critical performance, KPIs, and their use?
So I think one of the key things is, how do we define critical? Lots of organisations have lots of measures, but they can't all be critical, because critical in itself tends to suggest there's a small number of them and they've got a really high impact in terms of their sort of value.
If we get those wrong, they have a very big impact.
So is the organisation clear about what critical performance measures are? Often these measures, are the measures measuring activity, or are they measuring behaviour? Because if they're measuring activity, you could have some really high numbers, but actually they're not being very effective. Often, the focus really should be around, are they measuring behaviour? Because
what's happening,
and because that's what's going to have an impact on the organisation. Not how much, but it's what is it that's actually being done. So that gets into the sort of how they're being used and why they're being used. And if organisations don't get that mix correct, KPIs or performance measures can actually drive a particular type of behaviour, which is not the positive or the proactive type of behaviour that leads you towards and achieving unethical maturity.
And a common example of that might be, it's critical for leaders to be in the field, so we measure how much they're being in the field. Therefore, then we get this random number of participation in the field, but leaders aren't demonstrating the right practices when they're in the field. So therefore, then it's not actually getting the impact on the performance we want.
That's right. They're just counting numbers, not actually counting the impact or the effectiveness of that.
Right. So I guess the visualization of this is they're all interconnecting together. They all cross over each other. And I guess that's starting to introduce what we mean by a discovery process. You've got to look at all of this together, don't you?
It's deliberately designed as a planetary system, because at times they all connect. They're all interconnected. And you have to look at the measures of it. You have to look at these different aspects collectively in a connected sense, rather than looking at them individually. Yes, you'll get something out of looking at them individually, but you miss the added value of looking at them in groups or as a whole, because that'll actually give you greater insight.
And I guess just in summary of that, the KPIs we set might drive certain behaviours in leaders, which has an impact on the culture, which has an impact on how we're managing exposure. The system we set up has an impact on how leaders can practice, how employees engage, and of course the compliance to measures.
And the bit that you miss is you may have some insights into the drivers of what you're seeing elsewhere from the other parts of this sort of focus point.
Thanks, Tony. GPS, or when we're looking at this from a navigational point of view, there's probably two that have the biggest impact, don't they, on the overall part here, and that is our ability to get behavioural reliability or enabling behaviour in our workplace, and the citizenship behaviour, so the values driven. Why are those two so powerful in that compass driven feel about where we need to put our effort?
They're probably the elements that have, so the leaders have a significant influence over both of these, and they're also the two of the parts where individuals, employees, people within the organisation are probably more likely to be more actively involved. So you've got this leadership and involvement bit, which focuses in both of these areas, and they have a strong influence over empowerment and the organisation being integral in terms of its focus or approach.
And they're both very descriptive in what we're trying to do. One obviously is about leading with care or leading with values, so we can actually help leaders understand how to move forward in that direction. The enabling is about simplicity and practicality of systems, and again, we can really see that and monitor that and know whether we're enabling behaviour or making it very difficult. So those two are very tangible things that help us move forward. And when you get both of them right, you actually get empowerment.
Yes.
And you start to move closer to an integral culture. So that's from a compass point of view. If you really wanted to direct your effort, it's really about looking at our systems and the way they're functioning, but also looking at our leaders and the way they're leading, because if we're leading with values and the system is valued, people tend to make those things work well together. And
they're two very good, strong handles to be able to reorientate direction. And you need something to be able to keep on course, and these are the two handles that you can use to plot that course and make sure that it stays where you want it to be.
Where if we just try to create the direction of we just want more empowerment, that can seem a bit abstract, couldn't it?
Yeah, because empowerment just doesn't happen. You can't just flick a switch and say, right, everybody, tomorrow you're empowered. We know that doesn't work. It takes the combination of leaders leading with values and having systems which are enabling. Those combination of factors predominantly need to be in place and working well to provide the opportunity or the culture where empowerment is encouraged and sort of individuals have the ability to be able to act.
Yeah. So how would you know then that leaders are leading with values?
So it's about the consistency that you see. So across a leadership group, particularly in an organisation which can be disparately located, are you seeing consistency in the way that they operate from a values point of view? And there's obviously two parts of that. One is consistency when they're making decisions in a normal environment, but also when things are
in a high stress environment,
when things are tough, when they've got make some really challenging or tough decisions, are they still making those decisions from a values point of view? Because if you're seeing differences in either of those situations, it's likely that the values are not being there's not alignment of values within the leadership group or across the leadership group.
Or we're stayed in a certain set of values, and when things are good, we can probably stay connected to them. But as things stress, those values shift to something else, and therefore then that actually impacts our ability to create citizenship behaviour, because people are unsure which values are the most important.
They see the fact that the organisation will operate differently and its leaders will operate differently in times when times are hard. And we all know that organisations will be faced at some point with a situation where times are hard. And it's a true test of the organisation's values.
It is. And if you have a look at what's happened this year and impacted so many people and businesses especially, is how did leaders lead through moments like that, moments of crisis where you've actually got to step and align to values, what actually happened then. And that's what we mean by leading with values, isn't it? It's being able to not just state what's important and put them on a wall, it's actually, and do them when everything's fine. It's actually been able to back that up when things are stressful.
And there's no doubt about it, that's the hard part of leadership, is maintaining your sense of values and being true to your values when it would be easier for you not to.
And, we can understand what that looks like by the way we look at what's important to leaders. So actually get an understanding of what's important to the leaders, but also the perception that people have around what's important to leaders. Because what leaders think are important versus what people perceive their leaders see as important can be two different things. And that's the important part of a discovery process, is to really understand what the organisational teams and people, fabric, believe is most important. And that gets tested.
That's right. And that's why you have to look at leaders, and senior leaders and first frontline leaders, but you've also got to get the views of employees as well, because that's the mirror that the leader should be looking at.
Intent versus received. So, the compass allows us to look at the fact that the East-West process is probably the most important to keep that balance.
I think from an enabling point of view, the elements that are important there is the system allowing organisational behaviour to be positive or negative? So is it driving a positive outcome through allowing, the system is allowing people to behave in a positive way?
Right. Yep.
Or is it more of a conforming and reactive process, which is moving people towards having negative behaviours? And that's also the element. There's an opportunity for organisations there to set it up such that they've got greater ability on that side of the compass to be able to dial the gauge if they follow the positive rather than the negative.
So starting to summarise some of the things we've been talking about here for everyone when we get this discovery process put together. Fundamentally, we've been talking about sort of 5 key things. One is leadership, and we sort of broke that up between senior leadership and frontline leadership. Culture, so shared beliefs, maturity of culture. The engagement, so the participation we have from the workforce. The exposures themselves, so the way we're actually managing those hazards and understanding the combination of behaviour in the workplace, but measures all the systems process that's driving structure. When we think about the integral model, so for those who haven't seen the previous ones, give us a quick snapshot of the integral model. Ken Willer's
integral model is Ken's attempt to describe the world and everything that's in it. And it's a very simple 2x2 matrix, so you've got a vertical and a horizontal. And looking at it from the vertical point of view, so each of the 4 boxes, so there's a leadership box, a behaviour box, a culture box, and a systems box. And what Wilbur tries to identify is those things on the left-hand side of the matrix, so the leadership and the culture. Those are things that we know exist, but we can't see them.
So they're quite internal.
They're internal. So you know that everybody's got values and beliefs, but you actually can't see them.
So when we're looking at each of those 5 elements, we're looking at that internal aspect as well, the values and the beliefs around those things. Yep.
On the right-hand side of the matrix, the sort of top right and bottom right is the behaviour and the system. Now, those are things which people can see, and therefore you can measure them. So they're often the more comfortable or the more obvious size of the matrix. Now, what Wilbur is saying is that each individual box can act as its own ability to be able to describe things. So he calls them holons, or they can act together and provide a holistic picture or a holistic view of the world.
And I guess what other people might be familiar with in the terms of that is one's quite quantitative in nature. It's either there or it's not. It's either happening a certain way or it's not. They're generally quite observable and measurable per se. Where the other side is a lot more qualitative. It's generally feelings. It's generally stuff people describe, and it's not necessarily hard numbers.
They're more subjective. It's a subjective, objective balance as well.
So the important part of a discovery process is to look at all those factors together in the lens of qualitative, quantitative, subjective, objective.
So you can use the sort of model there. So when you look at leadership or culture or engagement, etc., is looking at it through what am I seeing, which is, if you like, thoughts and beliefs and values related, which would sit in the leadership box.
What am I hearing?
What am I hearing? What am I feeling? What do I see from a cultural point of view? What am I seeing from a behaviour point of view? So what am I actually seeing? What am I seeing people do? What am I seeing people not do? And what does the system say that should be happening? Now you can do that for each one of those 5 individual cogs. You'll get a picture for each one of those 5. Now the beauty of the model of the world integral model is what we often find when people look at things is they'll do some work and they'll find issues in the system. Or they may find things that are leadership or behaviour related or cultural related. But when they then come to work out what the solutions are,
they go system.
They go the system. But when you look at what they found things which sit in a leadership frame or in a behavioural frame. But they're actually not addressing those in the solution process. They're just putting in more systems.
Which can be counterproductive to the problem in the first place.
Exactly. So the beauty of the model is once you've got your 5 models and you can combine them into one model, then you reflect that over and say, well, okay, what does my solution look like? There should be a balance between the number of things that you found that sit in the leadership area and the number of solutions that are targeted towards those issues. And if the boxes, if the models are imbalanced, it probably means that you're not going to solve all of the issues that you found effectively or well.
Because the cultural issue might be driven by system. So by putting more system in place,
you're just making the culture worse.
You're just actually making it worse. We're actually stripping the system back might actually help that, which then relies more on leadership. So those things go hand in hand.
It does, and looking at it as a whole means that you can actually balance off, well, if I make a change here, where's the effect going to be in the rest of the quadrants? And actually, do I need to turn that up or do we need to turn it down?
Yep. So methodologies here, so people understand the discovery process includes a range of ways of getting information, so we can paint as clear a picture as possible of our current state, so we can actually paint a picture of the future state. So things like audits, pretty common. People are familiar with audits, go out, have a look at the system.
Yep.
Surveys, people are generally pretty familiar with engagement surveys, culture surveys, leadership surveys. Inspections, so go out in the workplace and have a look at what's going on, look at the workplace itself. Observations, so watching people do what they do. Have interviews with people, actually have conversations with them about what they see and what they feel and their perceptions of things. Doing collective focus groups, we can actually deal with a bit of that bias because there's multiple people in the room. It can have a little bit of groupthink, but you need to be able to manage that. Hence why interviews can help, because it can get rid of the groupthink, but can have a little bit more bias in it.
It allows you to test things out that you might find in a one-to-one with a group and see whether they're reflected or not.
And most organisations have been doing these things, or some form of them, or a variety of them.
And they'll have information in all of those, or some of those from some of those activities already. So it's not as though you're starting from scratch all the time. It's actually it's collecting them and looking at where the gaps and the holes are, and then going out to find, or being curious and finding out some more information that helps you build a better, a bigger, a more complete picture.
Yeah, so if you've got recent information, if you've done some recent audits, a recent survey, maybe just combining that with a quick workplace inspection, some observations, a few interviews and a few focus groups might paint a much clearer picture of what your challenges are and what you actually need to do to build a plan.
Sure. I think that the recognition here is that you're looking for a complete set, as complete a set as is reasonable of data, rather than having lots in one area. You might have lots and lots of audits, but you've actually got no inspection data at all. So you're missing a part of the puzzle. And missing a part of the puzzle means that you never get a complete picture. So you're always going to be, you're always going to be generating a less than perfect solution.
And what's the most common thing we experience here is generally we undercook this.
The biggest challenge here is spending enough time in this space. So people are always keen to get on with doing something. They always want to start the work. And therefore the tendency is to undercook the
discovery piece.
The discovery work that allows you then make sure that when you start, you're actually starting from the right place and you're moving in the right direction, and you've got a clear plan about where you want to get to and how to get there. So often organisations will undercook this. There's a potential that you could spend up too much time and you end up with
navel-gazing
and analysis paralysis. It's probably not as likely or not as often the case as undercooking.
No, we generally see people do a couple of the things to get an insight to problems and then off they go. And that leads to a couple of things. Are we starting from the right place? Are we working on the right things? Have we got enough information to help people feel comfortable to step into that white space? Because if we don't have enough information to step into the white space, what do we generally see? Resistance to the change.
And the white space stays scary for longer than it should be.
Because
people don't get comfortable because they're not seeing the things that they recognise quite so early. And they're missing bits of information that would help them generate a sense of comfort.
Because we hear the saying, people fear change. Well, yeah, but if there's clarity on how we move through that change, they generally don't fear it as much.
No, because the intention clearly is to generate a situation where the change is for the positive and it's leading to a better outcome. And often if that's very well explained, people will see the reasons why the change is important.
All right, so let's summarise this in regards to building plans and how that comes together and how organisations should really be thinking about to structure that change. So we've represented it here as a very structured bridge, something to get you from that A to B. So it's got to be well foundationally rooted down into both qualitative and quantitative data. Why is it important for us to make sure that the plan is backed up by those two types of bits of data?
Without a strong foundation, the journey is weak and potentially able to be blown off course quite very, very easily. So we've all had the experience of being on a bridge which is maybe not got as strong a foundation as it should have, and it's impacted by a small amount of external influence, a little bit of wind, and suddenly the journey is very, very unsettling. So it needs a really strong base, and that base is as we mentioned, it's a combination of the things, the things that we can physically measure and see, and the things that we can't measure, but we get a view and a feeling. And so the qualitative and quantitative are really important to give a balanced view of where we are and where we need to get to.
And to make sure that it's dealing, because as we said before with the integral model, if we just focus on the quantitative side, the black and white stuff, we may not necessarily be tapping into the thoughts and the beliefs and the values that are actually underpinning some of those challenges. So using both of those to prop up the plan. The plan should have 3 key factors to it, shouldn't it? Based on that original foundational model, there should be elements around what are leaders doing, what are we doing around cultural artifacts, cultural norms, and what are we doing around the system's effectiveness.
And again, we've emphasised that they've got to be connected and interconnected. There's no value, and there's no the likelihood of success is much less if they're dealt with separately as 3 individual components. They're actually, as the sort of diagram shows, they're part of one structure, so they're all connected together. If one part of the element isn't successful, the whole journey will collapse. So they've got to work in tandem, and they've got to be connected together, such that the leadership, the culture, and the systems actually generate a common outcome rather than 3 distinct outcomes.
Because if that whole platform's just dealing with system, it may actually be undermined by the fact that it's now negatively impacting the culture and restricting the leaders. Where if it's just leadership orientated, then it may not necessarily be adjusting the right artifacts that need to be established within the business culturally, and it may not be filling the gaps in the system that are impacting that reliability. So you need all 3.
You do, and if you change one, undoubtedly there'll be a need for changing the other 2 to help that first change be more successful.
So they're all interconnected, and obviously then we're going back to that original conversation around Whitespace and some of the other things. It should also include details around some of those asteroid orientated, those short impactful events, and how do we prepare for them and how do we plan for them so we don't actually get distracted and get off railed, derailed from the plan.
There's a level of preparedness. So if the discovery process has been done well, that should help to identify the likely asteroids that are going to be experienced as you make the journey, particularly in the early phases. Because you can predict those that are likely to happen, you've got the time and ability to be able to plan for them, put some sort of strategy in place to say this is how we'll tackle them.
Probably the little bit more difficult one, but the ones that if you do a really thorough discovery process you can identify are those black holes.
There'll be some indicators there of their potential.
This is what holds us back. This is what people in our organisations see as a negative draw back on the way we work. And you can define those, and therefore as you go through the plan, identify those a lot sooner and hopefully stop it drawing everybody in.
And I think the key bit there, John, as you like said, is the identification, is looking for those early indicators that say there's something on the horizon that could push us off track. It's the beginnings of the sign of a black hole. What can we do to actually keep people away from that? Because there is ability to be able to keep it, move away, draw people away from that so they don't get sucked in. But you've got to find that early enough to be able to put those things in place.
Right. So the plan's got to be holistic. It's got to be interconnected, and it's got to encompass both the qualitative and quantitative. And if your plans are built that way, they're very robust, and they're more likely to keep you on track to get you that B space.
I think the robustness is important, but also it gives you a degree of capability of adjustment. So we know that plans are very rarely
agile.
Plans are very rarely agile, but also they're very rarely wholly correct. So the plan you start with at the beginning is often not the same as the plan you have in the middle and the plan you have at the end. Having a robust, strong plan at the beginning should include the ability to be able to adjust things as you travel, but still stay on track.
Hence the navigational bit there. If you're travelling, sometimes we update our navigation based on detours.
Exactly. The map changes. So if somebody's built a new road, we've got to make sure that we know where that is.
I'll just start summarising our discovery process. So it's got to be holistic. It's got to really be thinking about the A space and B space, so current state and vision future. It's got to be looking at all those foundational elements, leadership, culture, systems. and what goes on in there. And we've got to look at the interconnectedness of those and build our plan around the fact that we've got subjective and objective or qualitative, quantitative information, and use both of those to actually frame up what we're going to do and how we move forward with that, and make sure the plan itself covers those three foundational areas.